Good afternoon, everybody. This is Meredith Ward with NASCIO. Welcome to the first webinar in the NASCIO Cybersecurity webinar series. NASCIO is celebrating Cybersecurity Awareness Month in the 6 or so weeks leading up to October by having a webinar series on different cybersecurity topics. So we'll have information at the end of this webinar how you can register for each of them, and I encourage you to do that. Also, welcome to our Cybersecurity Committee folks who are joining us at the regular committee time. So, like I said, we will go ahead and get started. And here are the folks who are on the phone today. We have a great panel that's going to give you a lot of great background information. Srini Subramanian from Deloitte, Eric Avakian from Pennsylvania, Michael Rowling from Missouri, and the fourth picture, that's me, Meredith Ward. I will be your moderator today. So, Srini, I want to turn it over to you first and talk a little bit about, you know, this is the one that comes out this year will be the 5th edition of the Deloitte-NASCIO Cybersecurity Study. So, you know, we really wanted to take a look back, being the 5th iteration, at how things have changed. We do this study every other year, and the first one was in 2010. And so kind of give us a little bit of a background and some history on that.
Sure, Meredith, thank you. This is Srini. Good afternoon, everyone, and good morning to some folks on the West Coast. I just want to maybe start with a little bit of background as to how this study came up about year 2009 or so, when we were really trying to bring the CIO survey type model to the CISOs. And at that time, Deloitte was doing cybersecurity studies in other industries like FSI and financial services industry and life sciences and healthcare. Global security studies, and we said, well, why can't we take some of those questions, really tailor them to state government-specific challenges and relevance, and then do a study. So when we made the proposal as a joint teamed effort with NASCIO to the NASCIO Executive Committee, we got a thumbs up to go ahead and do that for one survey in 2010. Now, that's really the starting of the journey, I would say. The next part was really getting the buy-in from the CISOs, that is the Chief Information Security Officer community. And quite candidly, there was some reluctance, right? There was some reluctance because the Chief Information Security Officers were looking for, well, how is it going to help me in executing my function as an executive of a state? How is this study and survey going to really help me? And really talking about some of our experience with the CIO surveys that NASCIO has been doing for several years, and also really documenting the specific objective of the survey to be, how does the information security posture of my state compare to that of my counterparts? And with some ancillary objectives on, well, you know, how do we compare with the trends that is happening in the rest of the industries? So we really did two things at that time. One was form an advisory committee of CISOs to the study itself. So every one of the studies since 2010 has had a subsection of the CISOs who form as an advisory committee, review the questions, advise on the changes to the questions, and the usefulness of that to the CISO community. And the second part was really a confidential report that maps an individual state's responses against the aggregate results. So this is not what you see as a public report, that is a study that comes out as a public report, but only the respondents in each state get this confidential benchmark so that they can actually look at the trends as to where they stand with respect to the other states and use it at their discretion with their leadership in advancing their security programs. So we did that first study in 2010, and I'm going to let when Eric and Mike talk about on how they are really finding use to the study itself and how in different formats that they are using and so forth. But that's kind of the history on the first study. And then based on the results of the 2010 report and how this was like the real, I would say, concrete data based on a survey of 49 states that responded in 2010. There was a conversation about the frequency, and the CISOs weighed in saying, well, maybe biennial, once in 2 years is better than a yearly survey that CIOs do. And then when we did the 2012 survey, we also introduced a smaller subsection survey that polled the business official stakeholders. So I think as the CISO role was maturing, that input from the business stakeholders also helped shape some of the priorities of the CISOs, I believe. And now we are, I can't really believe that we are actually at the 5th iteration of it. We have several results that the team is going to share today in terms of looking at the 5 survey trends. And maybe, Meredith, that's my initial comment on the history. I know that some of the people have not been through the journey the whole way through, but just to give some perspectives on how we got to where we are today.
Srini, that's great background, and appreciate that. And I think journey is probably the best term, and I like that a lot. So what we're going to do today is really delve into some of the highlights from the past 4 surveys and sprinkle in, as Srini said, some information, sneak peek about the 2018 survey. That'll be coming out at NASCIO's conference, October 21st through 24th in San Diego. And so we'll be on NASCIO's website shortly after that. And of course, we will highlight that at the NASCIO conference. But, a couple of kind of sneak peek type of information, just so we can, wanted to continue to get the information out to everybody in a timely fashion. And that, before we kind of get into the first slide here, definitely a call out, shout out to all the CISOs. This year we had 50 CISOs, all 50 states, complete the survey for the first time ever. So that was great. So on the first slide here, as Srini said, what we do is find key findings during the survey. And of course, those are the topics, the themes that kind of rise to the top. And when I look at 2010, I look at, CISOs look like they're kind of trying to tread water and just keep things running. And then as that progresses, you see in 2016, some of the themes are, governor level awareness is on the rise. Folks are starting to know more what cybersecurity is. It's becoming more of the day-to-day, the fabric of government operations, which I think is definitely, it's an evolution. And so for our panelists, I'll open it up to Michael and then maybe Eric after that. What do you think of this changing role of state cyber when you look, 2010 now to 2018? Any commentary on that?
Yeah, it's amazing over the last 10 years thinking about all that has changed and going back in time, to the late 2000s. Many states didn't even have the CISO role. And having established that role, I think is what has kickstarted the conversation. But back then, we all knew, we in IT, we realized what we needed to do, or at least we had an idea on where we wanted to go, but we didn't have that buy-in initially, because the powers that be, at the governor level, at the legislative level, they didn't quite understand it. They didn't quite have solid communication, quite frankly, from us in delivering exactly what we need to do. So there was a lot of gap back then, and other things that I think I've seen over the years that changed drastically as a result has been governance. And you guys mentioned journey earlier, and it's amazing to look back over time, the journey that many of us have taken together within the NASCIO community. But each state is truly different, and we all have to approach that journey in a unique way. And so that's been fascinating too in regards to governance, because not not all states are in that same boat, if you will, in terms of what they have control and governance over. And then, as we've become, as CISOs have become more of an influence, we've become more of a key partner over time, I think, especially with the CIO and various other partners along the way, including the governor's office, which I think we'll get to later, and our legislature.
And this is Eric. Yeah, just to echo on some of those comments. I mean, I can remember back in 2010, that first survey, and where states either didn't have a CISO yet, or some the ones that did were just kind of getting up to speed, really where cyber was at the time. Very operational and really focused more on keeping the lights on when it comes to security services. And then the morphing over time, and really how the joint survey has really helped raise the bar for cybersecurity, because it's given CISOs over the years, as we see the progression through each one of these time frames, how it's really helped CISOs raise the bar within their state to really make the case, whether it's promoting a new initiative or just saying, hey, look, here's where we are, here's where we stand, where do we need more resources, or where do we need to apply some more funding or resources to really improve ourselves. So it really has helped, and as you see this progression over the years, we see this further maturity where, again, as Michael was indicating, now the CISOs are partners with CIO. They've gotten a seat at the table, and they're now embedded in the governance processes, which are so key to really helping cyber enable the business, which is, at the end of the day, is really what it's all about. So the surveys, I think, have really helped kind of propel that maturity, and it continues. So very excited to see that further progression.
So you both really set this up beautifully for the next topic, and that's looking at something that both of you all mentioned, is that it wasn't that long ago to where all states didn't have a CISO or equivalent role. And NASCIO, I think, started charting this really in earnest in 2006, so that's where that 83% number comes from, and I think that's also when NASCIO really started advocating and saying states really need this CISO role, and then fast forward to 2016, where 100% of states have a CISO role, and so you all have talked a little bit about what the changing cybersecurity landscape has looked like in states. But Srini, I want to ask you, from your perspective, a 10 or a 12-year perspective, what has changed as far as the state CISO role?
Well, I think the solidification of the CISO roles and the functions across the states, for them to become more and more consistent since 2010, is from the survey in 2010. I mean, first and foremost, you see the trend in terms of the CISO role being a blessed executive role in a state that's like achieved 100%, and that's a fairly established role now. The legislatures know about the role. So I think in terms of establishment of the CISO role, the states are there. I think the trend we are seeing now is in the early days, it was a combination of operational role, like Eric talked about, started really as an operational role of doing some security functions, to more of a strategic role of looking at the strategy, the budget, and initiatives at a strategic level, risk management and compliance. And while some of the CISOs still carry the operational responsibilities, we are seeing more and more of that is either pushed down to lower levels of technology and other areas, or somewhat fairly outsourced. So the CISO's role is maturing to be more of a risk management function role. Is a trend that we are seeing. We'll also see that the chief privacy officer role while right since 2010 role, we've asked the question about chief privacy officer at an enterprise level, has kind of stayed in the same level, and CISO seems to do a good bit of functions or supporting the privacy functions in a support role as well. So the bottom line is much more maturity and more into the strategy and risk management role as compared to the day-to-day security operations role.
And Margaret, this is Eric. If I could just add to that. So totally agree. And it's just this progression over the years from an operational to strategic. And with that are really the soft skills. I mean, CISOs today have to be great communicators. They have to be educators for the executives in the business. So they have to speak the language of the business. And if we look back at 2006 to 2010, again, coming from an operational area, that really wasn't happening. So this position has really morphed where now the CISO is really speaking the language of the business. They're enabling the business so that they can demonstrate the value of cybersecurity. And that's a much different conversation from a role perspective than where we were in 2010.
You know, and that's interesting because I would also say that the CIO role has progressed that way as well, where, you know, this so-called soft skills, communicator, you know, negotiator are more important than we see, you know, maybe 10 or 15 years ago than technologist might have been ranked first. So nice to see the CISO role, Eric, as you said, evolving with the CIO role. So kind of staying on the workforce or the role of the CISO type of issue. So let's switch gears a little bit and talk about cybersecurity teams, the folks who work with the CISOs on a day-to-day basis in state government. So you can see that from 2010 to 2016, we saw a little bit of an increase for the majority of states having a little bit more full-time folks. And then in 2018, there you see similar, but I know we saw a little bit of difference in the FTEs for 2018. And Srini, any insight that you can add to that? And then after that, Michael, I'll ask you about your team in Missouri and if that's changed.
So in general, this is one area where even in the 2010 survey, when we got this data of 1 to 5 FTEs that are direct reports to the CISO. So there are a couple of caveats here. One is the largely federated model for the states kind of doesn't quite accurately represent the total number of dedicated FTEs that may be working on cyber. Because they may simply not be reporting to the enterprise level CISO, and they may be at the agencies. So while that factor or that skew factor still exists to some extent, the point that I wanted to make was even in 2010, when we had compared that with a financial institution that is a large financial company that might have a similar turnover as a state government, like $10 to $20 billion. Those CISOs had more than 100 FTEs reporting to them, even at that time. And those numbers have gone up tremendously because of the enormous amount of investments in cyber in some of the private sector, particularly in the financial services industry. Now, I would be really keen to get some feedback or comments from Eric and Mike on how they are coping with that challenge of doing or needing to do a lot more with such a small number of people.
Yeah, this is Mike. So, it's fascinating looking at the trends over the last 10 years and how we have really been in the middle of all that. We have, because back in 2010, there were just 5 of us. And over the years, we've grown. We're now up to 21 FTE. And I'll tell you that we've experienced some growing pains. Like many state capitals, we are not necessarily near a whole lot of talent. Jefferson City, we're right in the middle of the state. 120, 130 miles from St. Louis and Kansas City, where a lot of the talent is. But yet, how could we, for the other states where the capitals are in big cities, I'm thinking like Austin, how do you even compete with that talent? So there has been some growing pains over the years. We've done our best to hire within. We find that a lot of great talent comes from our own sources, especially end user support. They tend to deal with problems, and many times they're dealing with individuals who are VIPs or cabinet level members, members from the governor's office, et cetera, and they've been under the knife, if you will, and they can perform. And another place too that we look at unorthodox candidates. On our team at one point, we had a bouncer, we had a hairdresser, we had an admin assistant, and they've turned out to be some of the best employees that we've had. So I think that's how we have coped with it. It's still an issue, and as you mentioned, keeping numbers low. I feel like 21 for us, I think we're entering a sweet spot, and I think for a few reasons. One big reason, we've been able to implement a fair amount of automation and orchestration over the last several years. We don't watch glass 24/7, and primarily as the result of us using some pretty cool automation orchestration tools to tackle various incidents. And we're contemplating over the next 6 months, if we don't get to that sweet spot where I think we're going, we'll look at outsourcing.
Meredith, can I just add to that? So I think the fact that Michael's integrated orchestration is fantastic. And I think that's key, right? So where are some of the things, even if resources are scarce, can CISOs implement, what types of things such as orchestration to really take those human tasks and automate them to really leverage then those limited resources to do the things that humans are really needed for. So I think that's fantastic. And just another example of how do we organize for success. Pennsylvania went from 12 full-time FTEs to about 30, and we're in the midst of this IT transformation consolidation. So through this consolidation transformation project, we basically centralized. We went from a federated model to a centralized model where now the security teams across the agencies now report under our team. So we're all effectively one team, and the benefit of doing that now enables us to pool resources. So if we need to move resources, if there's an incident, for instance, and we need to pool resources to address one area over there, we can do that more efficiently today than we could before. So the centralization is going to have positive impacts. It also gives us agility from an economies of scale perspective, where we could really pool knowledge, so everybody's got the same training, the same knowledge and skills. There's no haves and have-nots. So I really think that the surveys help, because the survey results have helped us demonstrate that to senior management, that from a resource perspective, more resources are needed, but we need to make better use of the resources that we have.
So I like listening to you all talk about the creative things that you're doing with current workforce and to keep folks around. And also, Eric, that's a huge thing that a lot of states are facing right now, what you guys are going through or they have been through. And so things I think are really changing. But, staying on the workforce theme, one thing that we looked at in the study, a lot of things that these folks have talked about already, barriers or things that negatively impact CISO's ability to keep and attract cybersecurity workforce. And of course, salary rates, that's been number one, I think, for every single survey. Srini, you can correct me if I'm wrong. But these top three, lack of qualified candidates, leaving for the private sector, those have been up towards the top every single year. But, Michael, I really like what you said. I think that was a title of an article that I read that we were both quoted in, a bouncer, a hairdresser, and an administrative assistant, walking through. something like that. So, I really like the creative ways that folks are kind of dealing with that. So, for 2018, of course, the top negative impact, again, is state salary rates and pay grade structures. But I think that we've heard from these fine folks that CISOs are really doing what they can to combat that. But, anything else, the three of you, that you might comment on what is really attracting folks to come to and to stay in the service of cybersecurity in state government?
So this is Eric, if I could just touch upon. I think so salary has always been a challenge, right? So pay grades, but I think it comes down to really just knowing the person and what makes them tick. I mean, we've got different people, as Michael was indicating, all the different types of personalities that make up a security team. And kind of treating it really as a coach, as a team, like where are the positions on the field and who gravitates towards doing forensics or who gravitates towards writing a policy. And if that's their passion, and if they're passionate about a certain role, let them pursue that role and let them shine, give them the training that we need. One of the things we're doing here is in alignment with the NICE framework, giving folks a career path when it comes to roles and responsibilities so that they could pursue that passion and then further that through additional training and growth. And as long as people are growing, that's one of the things that really drives folks to stay. So we've had relatively good success in keeping our talent because we're really letting them take that position on the field, run with it, get better, improve, work as a team, and I think that's really been a big factor here.
That's great. I love hearing stories from states about that, and I know other states have. North Carolina comes to mind, doing creative things like hiring, really going after veterans, and Eric, as you say, folks who really want to serve and give back. So, switching gears just a little bit, another thing that we've really focused on in all the studies is a documented security strategy. And just quickly in this slide, you see the percentage of states that have a formal documented cybersecurity strategy. Interesting to see what the number will be in 2018, but what we do know from 2016 is that having a formal strategy can really help CISOs with funding, with getting more exposure, and with getting their kind of furthering their agenda. So interesting information there. But want to also talk about something that I think that all three of you have really mentioned is reporting and briefing, and how that has really changed as the CISO role has changed, as cybersecurity is becoming more integral part of the fabric of government relations. In 2010, really CISOs were reporting to CIOs or agency leadership. Wasn't really in the focus of a lot of governors. And then fast forward to 2016, 40% reporting to governor ad hoc, 29% monthly. And then in 2018, we see nearly 30% briefing governors on a monthly basis. That's huge, and a big shift from the last 5 years or 5 iterations of surveys. So any commentary, Srini? I'll throw it to you. What does that mean to you? What do you see when you see those statistics?
So, Meredith, really nice combination of the strategy and reporting or communication, right? Communication to the business stakeholders. So first and foremost on the strategy itself, when we simply reported, well, how many people have the strategy, and obviously the top challenge was the budget or the lack thereof that the CISOs have consistently reported. And when we had in the subsequent surveys input from business stakeholders where they considered the cybersecurity to be important, but they also thought that the states were much better off than what the CISOs considered the posture of cybersecurity was. So that highlighted the need to better communicate to the business stakeholders or the leaders who hold the funding to communicate the risks to them. The second point was on the strategy. The last survey, there was evidence that from the survey results that the states with documented and approved strategies are able to get more resources. I mean, we just heard from both Eric and Mike that the number of FTEs that they have, the resources that they have, is much more than the normal average that we are reporting on the survey results. So the evidence that having a documented and approved and communicated strategy is helping secure more resources, I think was a big reveal in 2016, and that improvement or the maturation is what you see in the reporting and briefing. Because initially in 2010 or so, the CISOs were primarily reporting to the CIOs or to the agency secretaries, and that reporting has matured over a period of time to 30% of the people now, states reporting to governors on a monthly basis. Well, part of the thing is, the cyber also took on much more of a business importance over the years. A couple of very visible breaches that needed governor level involvement, and organizations like National Governors Association pushing the agenda in front of the governors, I believe, helped as well.
Michael or Eric, has this changed for you since you first started as a CISO?
This is Mike. Yeah, it has. Back in the early days, reporting was ad hoc at best to the CIO, and the governor didn't really fully understand what was going on. I'll be honest about that. But over time, as we matured, and stepping back just a little bit, talking about our formalized strategy, without that particular document, we would not have grown like we have. We have a lot of small business owners over in our legislature, and they're not at all going to cough up additional funding for anything unless they see what it's going to go towards. So that's what we've been able to keep up to date. And many of the items within that particular plan, that's what we report on. So it kind of goes hand in hand. And so we started reporting to the governor's office on a monthly basis. And over the last couple of years, we've given access to the governor's office to log into a portal where they can view metrics in regards to our ROI and other activities real time. And I think that's been a big win for everybody, ensuring that they're aware of what we're doing, because that only helps us out in the event that we need to ask for more spend or to justify our existing spend.
And Meredith, this is Eric. So, yeah, I mean, part of the reporting is just getting the numbers right. So to echo what Michael was talking about, when it comes to presenting measurement at the higher levels, it's really so part of our governance process. So getting our governance process aligned and having those performance measures. So we have a performance measure dashboard that's been initiated, and that's all across all of IT. And then within those measures are the cybersecurity measures. So it's defining what the measurements should be, but making sure that the measurements are correct before presenting that at a higher level. So that's the strategy that we've been taking here, and we're providing those to the cabinet level. So the cabinet's got that visibility, governor's got visibility to those performance dashboards. But again, it's what are you measuring, getting the right measurements so that it's showing, again, value back to the business, so that if there is additional spend, as Michael was indicated, that's needed in certain areas, that's clearly articulated in the performance measures.
Great, and I like what Srini said, that one of the components of obviously everything that we're talking about, communication, such a huge component of that. So switching gears a little bit, we talked a little bit about some positive stuff and things that have really changed and evolved since 2010, but when we talk about barriers, a lot of the same barriers have been listed and chosen by CISOs since 2010. Of course, lack of sufficient funding. I would, if I was a betting woman, I would say 2018 might see something similar. Lack of visibility and influence within the enterprise. Who knows? Maybe in the evolving role of the CISO, as everyone had just talked about, perhaps that will not be as much of a barrier in 2018. We'll see. The inadequate availability of cyber professionals. We talked a lot about workforce a bit ago in this webinar, and I know that continues to be a challenge for CISOs. So kind of rolling along, one thing that we're always asked in this survey, in this study, is about IT budget allocated to information security. And we ask a parallel question on the CIO survey about technology spend in the states. And so, as you can see, it's remained somewhat similar. We see a little bit of a dip from 2012 to 2014. And then, but interestingly, in 2016, 20% of respondents said 3 to 5%. So we'll see, you know, in 2018 if spending remains the same, if it increases. Of course, it remains a top challenge. So interesting to see how that turns out. So, you know, Srini, you mentioned the Chief Privacy Officer. And that's one thing that maybe in 2006, when we first started charting the CISO role, maybe all states, there were no Chief Privacy Officers. We know in 2010, 18% of states have one. And in 2016, the same, 18% of states. In 2016. So then here's the number for 2018, 28%. So we see a pretty decent rise in that. And I'll ask Srini first, and then Mike and Eric, kind of your perspective on why do you think that is? Is privacy becoming more important to states, and if so, why?
So I think my point of view is, unlike the Chief Information Security Officer, the role and mandate for the privacy officer at an enterprise level is not well defined. And the states that have embraced, if you really do the research on the states with privacy officer, it's also that they have not consistently had a chief privacy officer throughout this period of the survey. So I think it is the not having the mandate, and if they had a chief privacy officer, consequently not having a team underneath that privacy officer has been part of the challenge. Now, going back to the couple of other data points that you mentioned, Meredith, on the barriers, I think I have to commend the CISO team and the NASCIO team. While the lack of sufficient funding has been the top barrier, if you actually look at the study since 2010, we had not really carried the flag on give me more money type of ask, right? I think it's been really in doing what we need to do within the constraints of a good bit of the security funding comes as part of the technology fund, which is not increasing anyway, as seen by the CIO surveys. So what are the things, the moves that the CISOs can do within the constraints of the resources of budget? But having said that, the IT budget of the percentage of technology continues to kind of trend around 1 to 3%, when the private sector is much more than that, and even federal agencies typically seem to trend around 15 to 20%. So I think that's an area we continue to figure strategies on what to improve. And Meredith, going back to the privacy officer, I think one of the surveys, 2014 and 2016, where we had highlighted that perhaps having a chief privacy officer complement the communication of the chief security officer in elevating the awareness beyond the technology group, in trying to get more resources might be a strategy that could work in breaking this barrier on the budget. So that's kind of my thought, not in a very coherent way, but I think those are that's kind of how I see the privacy officer could still be relevant if a state or two figure out a way of the CISOs and chief privacy officers working in tandem and complementing each other to really move the ball forward.
So Mike or Eric, does Missouri or Pennsylvania, do you have a chief privacy officer, either one of you?
This is Mike. We don't, but I would love to have one. I think having a chief privacy officer could help us out in a lot of areas. I know that role, as Srini mentioned, it's not well defined, but I think we'll know it when we see it. I think that role will have strong ties to compliance, legal aspects, handling of data, right? I mean, handling of data in a way that's outside of the traditional technical boundaries, if you will, the sharing of data. And I think, as time goes on, the proliferation of data and how it's shared and collected, it's only going to get worse. And so I think we're going to need to get our hands around this concept and get it applied quickly.
And this is Eric. So from a privacy standpoint, if we just look at this topic and just looking at recent news, things with Facebook as an example, the GDPR, and so privacy has become this big issue now. It's definitely at the top of many people's minds. It's kind of increasing where you're seeing privacy issues in the news almost on a daily basis, similar as we started to see with cyber several years ago. So I really think this is growing. Pennsylvania does not have a chief privacy officer. However, we do have folks that are filling these roles within our various delivery centers. So there is an opportunity now as we centralize functions to potentially utilize some of that talent into forming positions and really making use of those resources. And just to back up a little bit about the funding and just to kind of echo, I think what's been great or what's been helpful about the cybersecurity joint studies over the years is that this interesting outcome where you've got business insiders that care about cyber, but the funding has not been there. And when we looked at that and we took a look at the study specifically here, is really equating that back to the value, equating the value through measurable metrics for cybersecurity so that the business understands the value of cybersecurity services. We started establishing that sort of program here, building in return on security investment and showing the business, here's the return on investment for this service. And that has helped change the conversation from a cyber technical conversation to a business value conversation. So I think where the study has really helped us is that just in itself saying, oh, well, we're not providing value back to the business so they know how important cyber is. So we're continuing to make improvements in that area, but to me that has helped raise the bar for cybersecurity, and then I think the funding starts to come because the business realizes the importance of that program.
Great. A big part of a state cybersecurity posture, of course, is in practices and relationships with third parties. And so, this slide really shows 2010 to 2016, a CISO's confidence level in cybersecurity practices followed by third parties and how that's really evolved. And then continuing on the outsourced functions, as we've talked about here, that's obviously a big part of whether it be workforce or particular components of a state's cybersecurity operation, that different things are outsourced. And so here's a kind of a snapshot, 2010 to 2016, what states are outsourcing. So curious from the panel, and this slide is just a different way to display that information, but from the panel, what do you think is going to be for 2018? Anything new that you think states are outsourcing, or a rise, or a lowering of anything, any component? And I'll throw that out to anybody who wants to answer it.
So this is Eric.
Go ahead, Eric.
So just real quick. So I think when it comes to outsourcing, one of the recommendations is really just to take a look at what are the core services and core competencies within the organization. And I think that's going to vary depending on the state, the level of maturity, where folks are, what is their core competencies, but what do folks do well, right? So what do we do well as an organization, and where do we have adequate resources or where we don't have enough? or where do we have a hard time acquiring or keeping talent? And really taking a look at it from that perspective and say, okay, what are the things that then make sense from outsourcing? And then evaluating, considering candidates to outsource those non-core competencies, but then for the core competencies, expanding those with additional talent and resources. So when we took a look at this, at least, what potential are other candidates here, things that potentially would apply, something like auditing and logging is on here. I see that continuing. Risk assessments is still a top contender. Penetration testing with vulnerability management, and potentially multi-factor authentication as a service are things that we've started to see, going out and outsourcing for, where there's not a lot of talent in-house potentially, or not enough resources to carry out those activities.
So my comment was going to be on the kind of change in trends. Eric articulated really well on how the thinking has changed in terms of outsourcing, and really being pragmatic about maybe taking the workforce/talent issues and areas where it is much more beneficial to outsource and get the outsourcing service providers perform the functions. The trend I was going to highlight was in 2010, as you can see from the data, there was really more of a negative attitude to outsourcing, saying cybersecurity functions are mostly things that we want to keep in-house, and we may not be able to outsource a good number of them. But that's changed quite a bit in the last 8 years or so in the states taking, and the CISOs taking a more pragmatic approach of how they are going to leverage outsourcing as a tool and as a way of getting the functions done given the challenges with talent and workforce.
This is Mike. I'll chime in real briefly. We're continuing in 2018 beyond to outsource those key functions such as threat monitoring. For one, I don't know how you would do that in-house successfully. And along the same lines of doing risk assessments, performing red team engagements, and we're also looking at bug bounty programs. And so we're excited about those opportunities.
I think this really goes along with also what we're seeing with the CIO. CIO is broker model. Nowadays, we're seeing that more and more instead of CIO as owner-operator. So maybe CISO as broker is the next thing, or what we're also seeing now. And the last topic that I really want to get into today and look at where the survey has gone and where it's going is the CISO's top 5 cybersecurity initiatives. As you can see, risk assessments, training and awareness, they've been towards the top the last couple of years. And in 2018, the top 2 are risk assessments and metrics to measure and report effectiveness. So obviously, since that's a top 5, there are a couple others that go along with that. That'll be released when the study is released, but this gives you an idea of the top 2 that are on CISO's minds for 2018. Any kind of, Eric or Mike, your cybersecurity, your initiatives for 2018, anything you haven't mentioned that you would like to?
This is Mike. We're continuing to revitalize our awareness program. We've had a solid awareness program over the years, but that's something that we want to continue to ensure that it's fresh. And we're in the middle of doing that right now. To me, that has been the cornerstone of the change that we have seen over the last 5+ years, ensuring that everyone's aware of their responsibility, from cabinet level members all the way down to data entry clerks. It's just absolutely vital because it keeps that security culture full of good energy, and it keeps security top of mind.
And just to echo what Mike said, I totally agree with that. I think it starts with people So we've had a security awareness training and awareness program here. Obviously, everybody's mandated to take that. We're going a step further, expanding that. We really want to then reach out and expand that training for the counties, so that all the county IT staff are trained, and then continue with our social engineering exercises. I think it's really important while we're training folks to really make sure that we're continuing to test, not just that we test our users, but that we can identify and measure how well our training is effective. Because if we see that people are taking the training, but they're still clicking on emails, then potentially that shows gaps in training effectiveness. So again, it's using that measurement to then show the value back to the business. Another thing that we're working on, which Mike alluded to earlier, is the orchestration, and really taking a look at automating easy human tasks and utilizing automation to basically have those tasks let the technical piece do those tasks, and let the human resources, which are limited, focus on the analysis and all those things that are needed. So we're really focusing on some automation and orchestration here in the Commonwealth as well.
So, I just have a couple of final questions. I can't believe we're almost at the top of the hour. It's just been a great discussion, and one that I've really enjoyed, and glad to have three veterans to give their perspective. But obviously we've talked a lot about, again, the title of the webinar was, where we've been and where we're going. But I do want to touch on, we have one or two questions from attendees, but quickly I have two questions for you all. So the first one, the 2016 study was recently cited in the White House FY19 budget request. And it said the study was called the most comprehensive study of state-level cybersecurity spending. And so we've talked about this a little bit, how the study has helped you with budgeting and spending, but anything else, Eric and Mike, and then Srini will go to you at the end for a wrap-up, but anything else that the study has really helped you with that you want to highlight?
Yeah, this is Eric. I'll jump in. I think that if we just look at the studies, they've been a tremendous help for us to basically, again, first benchmark, right? So where are states going? What are the needs? Where's our gaps? And then again, I've really utilized. I've gone out when I go out and present, utilizing key findings in some of the studies of the past, and how folks can utilize that in their organization to further the message and to elevate cyber into the business discussion room, so that, because this is a business discussion, and how do we break those barriers? And we've come a long way. So I think the cyber studies helped us do that, and it's helped us have a business discussion showing the value back to the business. Again, when I talked about that disconnect earlier about the spend, and executives think cyber is important, but they don't get it, we've got to do a better job communicating the value for security back to the business. So that's how we've used it. It's been a tremendous helpful tool, and we will continue to do that. We're looking forward to the next study outcome.
This is Mike. We use it for benchmarking as well. We give it to the individuals upstream, the governor's office, cabinet level members, so they can see where we're at and what needs exist. And quite frankly, there aren't that many ways to benchmark states other than from a security perspective, other than this survey. So it's become invaluable over the years for us to lean on for various things.
So Srini, before I go to you for a wrap-up, I do want to apologize to our attendees. I've not been great on time management and leaving a lot of time for questions that you all may have, but one that's come in, and a couple on a similar topic, and that is procurement and cybersecurity. Two of my loves, of course, intersecting on this question. But this question is, there appears to be a huge disconnect between policy and procurement. Even where NIST is a policy, procurement isn't validating compliance. What is the panel's thought on mandating that procurement receives CISO sign-off in advance of contract execution and awards? And anyone who wants to take that, feel free.
What? So I just think this is part of a governance process, right? Establishing a sound governance process where the CISO, through just a mature governance process, has that sign off. So especially depending on whatever that business initiative is, that the CISO is part of that conversation. So if it's a new IT project that needs a procurement for something, that the CISO is brought in early on in that engagement and in those discussions through defined governance, so that they are there, that they're part of that process. And I think then at that point, it becomes a much more natural flow. So that's my thoughts, establishing and aligning governance with projects on initiation.
This is Mike. We try to be involved in all significant procurements. But, the issue with procurements that I deal with, I think we all deal with, is the fact that that particular contract, what's agreed upon, how can you ensure over that contract's lifespan that that third party is going to adhere to what they said they do? Because there's a lot that goes on behind the scenes that you may not necessarily be aware of, you may not have visibility to, because you are outsourcing whatever it might be instead of doing it in-house. So that's a key piece too, that we started to introduce some new tools to help identify some of that third-party risk, especially around potential new partners.
Thank you
Meredith,
both.
Maybe I'll just chime in. Yeah, let me just chime in.
Also, I'm going to give you the last word too. So maybe comment on that question and then take us home.
Sure. Thank you, Meredith. Well, on the question of that procurement, it's a great question, and I think the points that both Eric and Mike brought up are very valid and practical issues of just having contractual commitments for security alone by third parties or outsourcers or application developers is not adequate, and we have seen that most of the states still rely on that contractual commitments, but not really have a way of measuring the effectiveness of the security controls of those third parties in those contracts. So a combination of how do you get to the certification accreditation of the service providers from a cyber perspective, and measuring and monitoring the continuous compliance with those things that they committed to is an important measure. That was a point I wanted to bring up. But I think to take it home, I mean, first and foremost, this study is not possible without the commitment of the CISOs and how you have chosen to use it. Right from the first study where we had 49 states responded to the 2018 study, when every one of the 50 states responded, makes it that much more credible data for you. And I'm really happy to hear Mike and Eric give examples of how they are using it in their respective states to elevate the cyber brand. And we also talked about how the role of the CISO has matured and the security program is maturing. Now, we also know that there are quite a few more challenges to overcome. This is by no means, the road is not, we are not close to the destination of having overcome the cyber challenges. There are quite a few challenges to overcome still. So the journey continues. And let me turn it over to Meredith with thanking both NASCIO and the state CISOs for their commitment on this journey.
Srini, thanks so much. And like I said, excellent conversation. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you, Mike and Eric. Again, two long-time serving CISOs and two who never say no when I ask them, and that's much appreciated. On your screen, you'll see the vanity URL for the NASCIO Cyber Series. So please join us in the next 6 weeks until October and Cybersecurity Awareness Month kicks off. And we hope that you do. So thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you, panelists, and we'll see you on the next webinar.